Hey everyone! So what I'm going to do in this brief tutorial is show how we can use Fmod Studio to create a branching project. And this is a horizontal resequencing technique that allows us to go from one musical phrase to another musical phrase, but we wait for that musical phrase to end. So we don't interrupt, we make sure that the entire phrase plays out before we move on to the next state. And so I've created a new Fmod project here. I'm going to save it to my desktop as Fmod branching tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and create a new event. Remember, right-clicking is your friend in Fmod, so new event. And I'm going to actually create two tracks for this, so I can kind of go back and forth. Now, when you're doing underscore inside of Fmod, generally you don't need it to have distance attenuation. But distance attenuation means if I put a sound in a 3D world and I back away from that sound, the volume attenuates. It basically gets turned down as I walk away from it. Now, underscore, generally when you walk away from you never walk away from underscore, so you can actually get rid of it. So right click on that in your master track, just hit delete. When you do that, then it will get rid of the distance attenuation, which is what you want. Alright, so I'm going to go to my desktop where my files are. Move Fmod over a little bit, and I have a branching example here with all my files in it. And I have an intro, an end, and then 3 states. And each state has multiple phrases in it. So I'll kind of walk you through that. So my intro, I'm going to place my intro in here. Then I have state 1. Now, state 1 over here has A, B, C, and D in terms of its phrases. I'm just going to place them one right after another in here. So 1A, 1B, 1C, and later I'll put 1D. Okay, this is sort of an explore state. So I want it to loop in here, and so I'll basically go up here to my right underneath the timeline. You can add a loop region by right clicking, and I go to the beginning and I drag it to the end, and let's hear what that sounds like together. Zoom out here so we see everything, and I'll go back to the beginning and start playing it. So that's the introduction. Then we have state 1, and the state 1 is going to loop for however long we need it to. Now, this is a fairly minimal state. There's some silence in it, which is typical of, say, Western scores. A lot of Eastern scores wouldn't have any silence at all in their scores. That's a generalization. It's certainly not true for all games, but there are certain sort of types of games that utilize soundtracks that are based on a genre or a style of gameplay. In any case, here we go. That was our loop. It's looping fine. And to designate this a little bit, I'm going to add a marker at the front. And this marker is basically going to tell me that this is state 1, and so I'll call it state 1. This is useful later on. I'm going to need another marker later on called state 2, so I'll go ahead and put that in while I'm here. State 2. Okay. Then I need to drag in state 2. State 2 has 3 phrases, A, B, and C. So I'm going to go ahead and drag in state A. Uh, 2B, state 2B, which is the second phrase of state 2, and then 2C, which is the third phrase of state 2. I'll also need these to loop, so I'll right-click in the black region underneath the timeline, add loop region, and now this section will loop. I'll just play you the end of that to hear the loop back around. Okay, So it's working pretty well, meaning that I have a state 2 that loops and I have state 1 that loops. But now I need to get from state 1 over to state 2, and I do that through what are called transitions. And I can add a transition that goes to state 2, like so, and then watch what happens here. We play the end of phrase 1a, and that goes right to state 2. Now in a game, we don't want it to go right to state 2. We want to have some control over that based on a parameter within the game, like distance to enemy, or say a location, or number of enemies, or health, or things like that. So to mimic that inside the Fmod environment, what I can do is add a parameter using this plus command up here, and let's say it is number of enemies. And I'm going to make that parameter 0 to 10. Now it creates sort of what looks like a timeline, but the timeline has been replaced by integers that go from 0 up to 10. It relates to my new parameter that I just created, going from 0 to 10. I can place sounds in here, which doesn't really work for the branching project, but there are other projects where placing sounds in here might be interesting. So go back to my timeline. My state 2 transition that I have here, I want it to reflect this parameter. So I can go down, when I click on it like this, it gives me the inspector down here, and I can add some conditions, like I want to add a parameter, number of enemies, and when the number of enemies is above 2, or 2 or above, oops, like that, then it's going to transition. So if I leave the parameter at 0, it's not going to jump. It's just going to play that next phrase, which works out great. And then if my enemies is above 2, then it will actually jump to that section. And so it's working. I'm going to save often. I can copy this transition and then paste it at the beginning of every phrase. One more. So if my number of enemies is 0, then it's going to continue on, and we'll hear this third phrase in state 1. Then our enemies go up to 4 in the game. The game would be passing that parameter to us. Then it would jump to state 2. Okay. So I'm just going to mock up state 3 really quickly. So I'm going to need a marker here called state 3. I'll drag in state 3. And state 3 has just 3 phrases as well. 1, 2, 3. I'll go ahead and loop those. Here we go. All right, so that section's looping, and then I need one more section here at the end, so I'll call this ending. And I'll put my end here. The end doesn't loop, so we don't need to add another loop region for that. Okay, so state 2, we're going to need some markers here that basically get us to state 3. And I want to have a parameter condition that basically says that my number of enemies is above, say, 6. Then we'll go to state 3. So I'll copy this a bunch of times. So right-click, copy, paste it in. So I pasted it there, and then one more at the front. So I go here, paste it to the front. then likewise, state 3 needs to transition over to the ending. So based on a parameter. So if my number of enemies goes back down to 0, then I want to go back to the ending. Now this is a little bit like a level that's on rails. For instance, I'm not going back to the beginning at any point, but I could by adding another transition that goes back to state 1 here, right? I could add that going back to state 1 on some other parameter condition if I want to. I'm going to get rid of it for right now and just show you how this whole thing works now. So I start at the beginning. My number of enemies at the beginning is 0, so I just move that down to 0. I'm going to play one phrase of each one of these. So right now, state 2 is set up to go to 2 enemies, and so I'll go up to 2 enemies. Now we're in state 2. State 3 is 6 enemies or more. So wait one more. My enemies got up to 6, so now it's going to jump to state 3. All right. This last transition is set up to go when the enemies get back below 0, then it would continue. Now, that didn't work, so I want to look at how these are set up. Oh, it's because I forgot the trigger condition I did afterwards, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these two. So sometimes you run into mistakes and you're like, oops, I forgot to do something. Maybe you guys noticed that while I was doing it. I didn't notice that, sadly. And I'll paste this in like so. So now when I'm in state 3, it's going to stay in state 3 until my enemies get back below 1.5. I don't know when you would have 1.5 enemies. Maybe that's like an enemy and then, I don't know. All right, so then I go back to 0 enemies and then now you may be wondering what happened there. Basically, it looped from the end of state 3 back to the beginning, and this is the transition point that sent it over to the ending. That's the tutorial for today. There's a more advanced version of this which uses reverb tails dependent on where you're coming from. Much more complicated, but check it out when you get a chance. Thanks.